you go first.
All right, and we are live. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. We are at History as Testimonial. If in case this is your first session of the day, let me just give you a quick rundown of how things will work. We'll have a 20-minute panel discussion and then 20 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions, you can submit them with the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat to the right of your screen, and you can use that to communicate with other audience members, other listeners. And if you post a question there, don't worry, I'll catch it and direct it over to our panelists. So without further ado, let me get out of here and you guys can start the show.
Great, thanks. I think I'm the moderator, so I should probably introduce myself.
Yeah, first. You go ahead.
So I'm Eric Marcus. I'm the founder and host of the Making Gay History podcast. What we do is we bring LGBTQ history to life through the voices of the people who lived it, drawing principally from my archive of more than 100 interviews that I recorded in the late 1980s and the late 1990s for 2 editions of my book, which is called Making Gay History. We've been, we just finished our 7th season. We launched in 2016. We've done 80 plus episodes, downloaded 3.2 million times in 200 countries and territories around the world. But that is nothing in comparison to Roifield Brown, whose list of podcasts, Roifield, we've talked before, and I just thought you had 2 podcasts, but I did some research on you, and you have a long list of podcasts. So it's not just the one about Jamaica or the one about the presidents. You've got like a half dozen, am I right?
Yeah, but it's only because I've got a short attention span. I really admire people who can drill into one subject and become professors of it. I can't. I just kind of skim the surface and just like run away with little bits of nuggets of information. So I always forget 1 or 2 podcasts, but I go 10 American Presidents, Dum De Dum, How Jamaica Conquered the World, Intelligent Speech, The Things That Made England, How Jamaica Conquered the World. Yeah, and I'm missing 1 or 2. I always forget 1 or 2.
Missing in there. I know. Yeah.
It's a good thing they're not your children, as in children. We'd be sitting here, and one of your kids out there was
like, "Oh, I'm so angry."
Yes, and Pete, you have 1 podcast.
Sort of, kind of. I kind of dabble a little bit, following in Roifield's footsteps in some sub podcasts. How we started 7 years ago. I started as a host of the Bohemican podcast and my journeys as an American expat living in Czech Republic. And then I did a co-host position for 7 years with my one of my podcasting buddies, Travis Dow, who did the History of Alchemy podcast. So that's how I got started. And now I've jumped on over to do my own YouTube show / podcast called Past Access. And that's kind of the reason why I'm on this great panel with you guys today, because we talk about people with disabilities, such as myself. I have a mobility impairment as a spinal cord injury person, and traveling the world. So I try to give people that inspiration that love history as much as I do to get out and see things via wheelchair.
Mm-hmm. So we all 3 use personal testimony as part of our work. And I'd like to talk about the advantages of personal testimony and the disadvantages. So because not everybody remembers things correctly, and we'll get into that. Pete, I just wanted to comment on listening. I listened to one of your episodes with your son, which is from a few years ago,
right.
about the old new Jewish synagogue in Prague.
Yeah,
and it was lovely that you enlisted your kid in your podcast. So if you can start with what are the advantages and liabilities of working with your child?
It was like, well, I tell you what, when we recorded that, they were called Bedtime Stories with Nathaniel, my son. And we did 3 episodes of those, just kind of interspersed in my normal programs. And it's just, before we went to bed, I would tell him a story about Czech legends, because he's going to be a proud Czech American. You know, both those cultures blending together. And boy, he must have been maybe 8 or 9 when we started doing those, and now he's 14. So I have him included now as my cameraman, and on occasion when I have enough money, I'll take him to some of these trips to Paris or Florence, and he'll be my cameraman for the YouTube show, which is great. So he helps his dad quite a bit, which is nice. But, you know, I would say, you know, it is interesting. It really is cool because here in Prague, we have a lot of history, religious history, of, you know, the schism that you had in the church between the Catholics and the Protestants and the wars that resulted with those. And we have a lot of horrible history with the pogroms that went against the Jewish community here. And it's interesting that 2 Catholic guys, me and my son, are talking very well versed about the Jewish tradition that's here in Prague and the little town of Josefov, which is right on the Vltava River. And it's just rich in history and legends. And they teach him that in school, and it's really kind of nice to see that there's a broader scope of what's out there for him.
So what were the advantages of having him as part of the story? And then Roifield, I have questions for you about this.
Yeah. Well, I'll say just real shortly, because I'm anxious to hear about Roifield's viewpoint on this too, because I know his kids, he's got so much going on with that too. And I look at it as it's something I love to do, and I want to get my son involved in it too, in many ways, to know what his dad's doing besides working all the time and you know, being a daddy taxi, you know, taking it to practices and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I see that he sees how I interview people. He sees that I'm a decent listener, and I'm able to kind of get that information from somebody without being abrasive or judgmental. And I wanted him to see that because I think that will carry him far in life. So I wanted him to be a part of the show for those reasons. Mm.
So Roifield, you use such a range of people in all of your podcasts. And what is the advantage? Because often a lot of podcasts are 2 people talking to each other, as opposed to bringing in voices from other places.
Well, I think for me, I've always loved history from when I was a child. However, I didn't study it at university, so I'm not at all an academic. So that kind of really goes to inform my application of how I've actually put my shows together. So specifically, the first podcast that I did was How Jamaica Conquered the World. And the story of mass non-white immigration into the United Kingdom is only just over 70 years old. It's after the Second World War. So there's this first boat, it's called the Empire Windrush. It came into Tilbury Docks in 1948. There are still 1 or 2 people that were on that boat that are still alive. You know, I know it's a similar thing with your Making Gay History podcast. So you can tell the history, but it still doesn't feel, but it's still tangible. You can still touch it, you can still taste it. Those people are still there, you know. So for me, it was a way of fleshing out the subject, but then also specifically the Windrush generations now is become told. It's those non-white immigrants that came to the United Kingdoms, really England, as opposed to the other bits of the United Kingdom from 1948 up until the early 1970s. There aren't that many books about them. So I was really conscious that when I was doing my podcast, I was writing this history, but it's still, as I said, a breathable history where I can record people who did things that helped to change Britain, but also go to Canada. One of the proudest moments for me was taking my 2 Canadian, British, Jamaican children to see the Consul General, the Jamaican Consul General in Toronto. And they knew that their dad, and my son was, I'm going to say he was 11 at the time, so my daughter would have been about 8. And they knew that dad was doing this thing. And they came with me for a day out, really. So I'd flown over to Canada to go and see them. We went to see the Jamaican Consul General, and they were sat in the room. I interviewed him. He was utterly fantastic. And then I said, okay, then that's the end of the interview. And my son said, Daddy, can I ask a question? I nearly cried on the spot, right? And my son said, he said, when the Jamaicans first came to Canada, were they treated by the Canadians? Totally legitimate question. you know. And then my daughter, not to be outdid, at 8 asked the question, right? So for me, it was really important to tell this story, a living, breathing story. Like my folks, I call myself English, but I'm also Jamaican. My parents were born in Jamaica. They did that journey. You know, we're not writing about this on bits of parchment or vellum and whatever, and trying to interpret how did they feel, and let's imagine. You just go ask them. So go ask them.
Yeah. It's extraordinary to be able to write or record history that's still alive. When I began my book in 1988, a lot of the people who had founded the movement, the LGBTQ civil rights movement, then called the gay and lesbian rights movement, were still alive. And there was no internet, so the research was a little challenging, but I could pick up the phone. And it took 25 or 26 phone calls to find a woman named Edith Ide, who published the first magazine, as she called it, or a zine as we'd call it now, for lesbians on her office typewriter in 1947, typed it twice with 5 sheets of carbon paper. She was there. The dinosaurs still walked the earth. And one of the frustrations I find now about, as much as I know about this history, is that because it wasn't taught in schools, and I'm guessing that the history you've recorded, Roifield, has not been taught much yet in schools, that even reporters in today's New York Times, there are reporters writing about Stonewall, and they got it completely wrong because they don't know. They just don't know the history because it's so fresh. But so go ahead. I'm sorry.
I do think this is one area, not only the one area, but one area where what we are doing is so important. And it's much more important than traditional historians actually give us credit for. I do have a little bit of a problem with people doing, I'm going to invent a country. It's called West Eastland. Okay, on West Eastland is a European country, and you know it fought in the First World War. It's escaped the Second. It was behind the Iron Curtain, etc., etc. We all kind of know that East West Land exists, and I have a little bit of a problem with podcasters reading 2 or 3 books about East West Land and then kind of just regurgitating that. Yeah. And fundamentally, they're not really adding anything to what we know about East West Land. Yeah. Right. So this is where podcasting is really creating that trove of first-person narratives, which when the books are starting to be written about the gay struggle and it's seen as legitimate canon, or disabled people traveling the world, all of these relatively new patterns of migration, they're going to come to our sources.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they will. Yeah.
So, I mean, could you imagine what it would have been like in World War I to have someone that had survived the Battle of the Somme or Passchendaele and had a podcast-like forum that's recorded forever for posterity?
Yeah.
And that we could go back and look at that and feel from their words and through their eyes. Now, we don't have a whole lot of that. We have, some written issues. I think there was recently, I read someplace maybe in the papers in England that there was last year, a person had a suicide note that they wrote because of PTSD from World War I. And it's the only note that ever existed to the family. Now, I can't imagine that's the only thing that was ever written, but things just weren't saved. So going to what you're saying, Roifield, I think it is a wonderful time to be a podcaster because this stuff is kept, it's recorded, it's transcribed, it's shared to have this first person account that will be, I think will be instrumental in understanding our era of our existence in the early 21st century, centuries down the road.
Well, go ahead.
Eric, I was just going to say one more thing.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely spot on, Pete. And the other thing is as well, is that we are trailblazers in saying that this history, this narrative is important, whatever the heck it is, because academia has to catch up, and it's a legitimate catching up, right? Nobody in 1948 was writing the history of the Windrush boat coming to Tilbury docks when those first Jamaican immigrants got off the boat, because it just happened, you know. So whether that is 50 years hence and people start writing it, or 30 years hence and whatever, we're in the vanguard of all of that, you know.
So Pete, I should just tell our viewers, in 3 minutes, we're going to start taking questions. So if you have a question, put it in the question box and we'll get to it. If you have no questions, we have plenty to talk about.
Oh, yeah, sure. It's not a problem.
Not a problem. Not at all. So Pete, in your work, what you're doing is laying down a narrative for a group of people whose stories have really not been recorded, certainly not by another person who's lived the life that you've lived and is now traveling the world and experiencing the world from a wheelchair.
Well, isn't it? It's all about perception, isn't it? I mean, it's the self-perception that we have from maybe our groups, and then there's that global human experience that we all share, that brings people to good storytelling and listening and being engaged, right? You know, when I think about the LGBTQ group, I think about that umbrella that keeps getting bigger to be more inclusive. And I automatically think, in some ways, different but similar to the disabled movement in the 1960s with Ed Roberts and the Berkeley movement for independent living. By the time that I was, paralyzed in 1984, I still had to fight my way to get into the public school system. I had to fight for those rights still that are somewhat, okay. And after, the Americans with Disabilities Act it was a big deal. And that umbrella is huge. It's people that have visual impairments, hearing impairments, mobility impairments. The list goes on. And reaching out to people can be a challenge when you have such a big umbrella. So I find that to kind of broaden that story, I need to be more welcoming to people that have nothing to do with disabilities, that they can tune into my show and say, hey, I always want to see what it's like to go to Amsterdam. Oh, and by the way, Pete's in a wheelchair, so we're going to see some wheelchair cool things. Now, I never thought about that. When I talk about Paris and I talk about giving a hint, saying, the Sacré-Cœur is on top of a giant hill in Paris. There's no way you're going to wheel up that hill. But if you take a taxi to the back door and tell the guy, the janitor, there's an elevator that can take you to the top, that helps a lot of people. And it's kind of a side note.
Absolutely. I took my grandmother to Paris when she was 89 years old after she had a hip replacement. She had a shattered thigh. And so getting around, she could walk and slowly, but there were things about Paris I would have loved to have known from your podcast. This is now 1992 that we went, because it was not the most friendly place where if you live long enough, you'll be impaired in some way.
Well, I'm a person of hope in the sense that, I've been visiting Europe since the early 2000s. I've lived here almost 10 years. I've seen changes in Budapest. I've seen changes in Paris. I've seen changes in Copenhagen for wheelchair accessibility everywhere. And there's so much more work to be done. Don't get me wrong, but things have really been on an upward move. And I think a lot of that can be thanked to what we've done in the United States with our acts for people with disabilities. And I think we've in one of those cases that's nice to think about every once in a while, we've moved that bar a little further down the road. And I think that's all we can really hope for us when we talk about maybe our minorities or talk about our individual groups, that before we wrap up our time on the planet, that we kind of move the bar a little further down for the next group of people.
I'm going to start with the questions. So this question is, one of the things I find so valuable, particularly about history podcasts, is how they make it possible to see patterns in human behavior and how those patterns are expressed across time. I simply don't think this was possible in earlier eras, when the only way to learn the information was to read it or study it in school, both of which are limited. What are your thoughts? Roifield, you want to take that first? I can. Shall I jump in and then
you jump in? I'm still collecting my thoughts on this, because I might say something. I might have a slightly contrary view.
Now, my education in history, when I think of taking history class, it's social studies in New York, it's called. I was in junior high school. My history teacher read from the textbook, and we had to take notes, and that was how he lectured. And every now and then he would mention when we touched on World War II, he'd mention he was in the Battle of the Bulge. But he wasn't interested. This is one of the biggest battles, most consequential battles of World War II. He wouldn't answer any questions about it. And I thought history was the most boring thing in the world. I mean, let alone patterns. I just thought it was just this boring narrative until I started talking to people for my history book, for an oral history. And then there were patterns to be seen. So, for example, a question I often get, or a comment, like, why can't LGBTQ people or gay people get along the way we once did? Well, I could see patterns across right back to 1950. When the first organization, the first sustained organization, was founded in the US. And the guys who drank tea with their pinkies out and the guys who drank tea with their pinkies in hated each other. So it's the femme guys and the masculine guys who didn't like each other, and men who didn't like women, butch women who didn't like women who were either not butch or not femme. And then the trans guys, the trans women, and the lesbians, the radical lesbians. So I could see across time, gay people have never gotten along that well, but we've been compelled to work together because we have. Roifield, you have thoughts now, I can see.
Yeah, so for me, what unites humanity to how Jamaica conquers the world is there's this story of humanity. And it's not actually, people think it's a story of the history of Jamaica. It's a story of how Jamaican culture has influenced other countries. So without the island of Jamaica, there's no hip hop. And that's not hyperbole. The first progenitor of hip hop played two turntables and a microphone was a Jamaican immigrant. And he did it because that was how you played music in Jamaica. You chatted over the records. But doing that in the Bronx in 1968, African Americans were like, we don't like this reggae thing. So he did it with soul records and it became hip hop. And what I'm trying to do is actually tell a universal story. So those are the patterns that immigrants go, and I use Jamaica really as an example because that's what I know inherently. I've gone all around the world and created new societies, new communities, new languages, new forms of dress, etc. So hopefully what people see in the patterns of my show is just actually humanity. You know, that you can transpose the Jamaican immigrant experience. So it's always a story which my mom and her generation always say, and they say when they came to England, I was about to do a Jamaican accent, but I just caught myself. When I first came to England, I thought, wow, there's factories everywhere, but where do people live? And it's because the houses had chimneys and there's smoke coming out of them.
Right.
And I thought these are factories of every immigrant of my mother's age says the exact same thing. It says there's work everywhere, but where do people live? You know, and a little detail like that, we can capture that now. And that would have been lost if, you know, hundreds of years ago it had been written. So we don't have, when the first pilgrims went to North America, they're little nuanced observations. We don't have that, do we? No. You know, when the first Chinese workers left China and came to San Francisco on the west coast of America in the 1860s for the 1840s of the gold rush, we don't have their very first, what did they first notice? We don't have that. We have that they came.
Right. I interviewed my grandmother who came by boat to America in 1903 and was 1909. She was 6 years old and spent a few weeks on Ellis Island in isolation because she was ill in quarantine. And I recorded 6 hours of interviews with her to ask her those questions because when she was in her mid-90s, I asked her about them because those details would have been lost. She didn't share those. Actually, she never talked about the trip until I started asking her. I need to ask Pete, you a question that's come in. And I'm not going to have each of you answer each question because there are
hopefully there's a lot.
There's a number of questions and all three of us can talk at length. this is, we need to make sure that children are educated, that individuals with disabilities are also included as a minority. Ed Roberts and others should be part of children's education. What have you seen being done to include this in education?
Well, it's great that you mentioned Ed Roberts and the Berkeley movement in the late 1960s. And, there are trailblazers in the disabled community that we all know in bits and pieces, but we don't think that they're trailblazers. And some of that is kind of the crux. And boy, I don't want to open this Pandora's box when I say this today about, taking down monuments and those type of things, as it's very topical to this minute. But how we remember history is somewhat important too. And the one I'm thinking of right now is the disabled community looking at Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I remember, gosh, when I was in college, I came and did a documentary on the Roosevelt Memorial that was being put in Washington, D.C. It was probably 1997, 1998. And I remember, there was a big hoopla because he's sitting in a wheelchair, covered his lap, so it doesn't look like he's in a wheelchair. But in the back, the sculptor put a little bit of a wheel to be seen. But you had to walk around the monument to look at it. And a lot of people, myself, like, well, where's my representation? He's an American president in a wheelchair. Well, to him, in his context, he didn't want to be seen in a wheelchair. And so those are tough historical questions on who is considered a trailblazer and maybe the disabled community. So, it's not an easy question to answer. I would love to see more people mentioned in history books that had a variety of different types of disabilities that have done amazing contributions to the world or to the United States.
Roifield, are you seeing any migration into education settings from either your podcast or other work that's been done about the Jamaican migration to England?
Well, here's another story. So my daughter, I've got a daughter that lives in London who actually has been helping out moderating this for us today. And she's done an amazing job. Chip off the old block, she's doing history and politics as an A-level. And she was in one of her history classes, and a history teacher was talking about the Windrush generation and how there's a wonderful podcast called How Jamaica Conquered the World that tells you all about it. And she went, my dad does that. Yeah. So, and that does happen. And I've had that from not only from How Jamaica Conquers the World, but also from 10 American presidents. I think it's really important that us as fans of history use all the tools that are available for us to tell great stories. Human stories, real stories, stories with emotion, not forgetting the true historical or geographical or travel content, whatever. Mm-hmm. So all our dates are correct, all that stuff. But we are engaging our listeners because as you said, Eric, for me, history at school was never boring, but I'm going to be quite arrogant here now. I always knew more than my history teachers. I did. And Mr. Clapton, when I did my GCSE history, would always, in the middle class, he'd say, Brown, was that date correct? And I'd go, no, you're out by a year. And he'd go, okay. And he would just, like, I knew more than him. I was such a geek and whatever, right? But most people say exactly what you said, Eric, that at school, history was boring. Yeah. We have the ability to turn that on its head because the best dramas, the best soap operas, the best thrillers are actually stories from history because they were real.
Yes, you can't make it up.
No, and I always and I'll just shut up now. I always one of my favorite films of all time is Waterloo, where Rod Steiger plays Napoleon. And the scene where he comes back from Elba with 1,000 troops, and all their uniforms are dirty and whatever. There's only 1,000 men, and he's marching up, and then Ney comes along with his whole brigade, and he's been sent by King Louis to put him in an iron cage, and all these French soldiers march up to Napoleon, line up, and Ney says, "Fire!" And Napoleon just stands there after telling his troops just to stand down, and not one of them fired. If this was a Hollywood movie with no historical background, you say, nah, one of those 30, 40 men would have fired, not one. And it happened more than once.
Mm-hmm.
You know, history's amazing.
It is. So when I started my work in the late 80s, there was virtually no LGBTQ history taught. Again, it wasn't LGBTQ then, it was just lesbian and gay history. Yeah. And now suddenly it is hot. I lived long enough to see that happen. I work with a couple of different organizations in developing resources for educators who are being mandated in some states to teach this history and integrate it into the American story, because it is part of the American story. So I work with an organization called History Unerased at unerased.org, and also Facing History in Ourselves. They'd kill me for not remembering. So Facing History in Ourselves, both have developed educational materials, as has the One Archives at the USC libraries. So then they use my podcast. We produce special short versions of the podcast, 6 minutes for classroom use. It's been thrilling to watch this move into the classroom, but what I've come to understand from my colleagues at History Unerased is it's a really complicated history for teachers to teach, because most of them have no education in it. And things can happen in class, like a student suddenly comes out in middle school during a class on this history, and then what happens when another kid in the class reacts negatively? Or what happens when you're teaching this the first time and your somewhat conservative principal walks into the classroom? I mean, there are all kinds of issues. And so it turns out professional development is a key part of teaching LGBTQ history, to teach teachers how to teach this history. So there's another question. I'm going to find it. I've always thought, this is along the same lines, I've always thought podcasts would be a wonderful resource for schools. Have any of you had any engagement with your local schools, particularly primary education? Pete, have you?
Well, in Czech Republic, my language skills in Czech are not very great, even after 9 years being here. But when I lived in Atlanta for 12 years, my job was with Shepherd Center Hospital, Rehabilitation Hospital in Atlanta. And my job as the community relations coordinator or manager was to go out and talk to young people about living with a spinal cord injury and how to avoid it if you could as an acquired injury, wearing helmets, safety belts, those type of things. And it was great to reach out to tens of thousands of kids every year for 11 years. That very fulfilling to me. It was one of the best things I think I did in my career, to talk to kids that, you know, my life might look different. My goals are not that different from everyone else's, to have inclusion, to be able to enjoy life, to be able to do the things I want to do. And I think by just even going and showing up, and being energized and ready to have a conversation with a 7-year-old versus a 17-year-old, I think makes a difference. So I think even just, you know, being there is a big point. Now, as far as podcasting, I've said this before in the earlier things. I think it's just one of the best, like, First Amendment type of, you know, get out there and talk and show your freedom of speech, and to kind of do it on your own terms in a lot of ways. I love that I'm around at this time to be able to do that. I can pick a subject and I can go with it.
Yeah. Now, Roifield, did your kids ever invite you into class for show and tell?
Yeah, but but it all gets mixed up with the whole kind of podcasting thing, because we are educators, aren't we? You know, so I have been into my daughter's class to talk about, this is a few years ago now, to talk about how Jamaica conquered the world. And also I've gone in to talk to teenagers, sixth formers, as we kind of call them. That's been the ages of 16 and 18 in London, about having inquiring minds because of my podcast. So it's work which sounds somewhat trite to say, it's highly rewarding and stuff, but I haven't done it enough. So people, please, I'm very easy to find on Google. There's only one Roifield out there. Go Google me and invite me to come along, and I'll come along to your school and talk to your children.
I would love to tag along for that, just to kind of sit in there. listen to your stories.
Roifield, that then begs the question, because I'm curious by nature. It has often gotten me in trouble, but where does the name Roifield come from?
So actually, this goes to Black identity, right? So think about this, right? In an American context, the African-American names, like LeBron, let's say, right? You know that is an African-American name now. That only comes about in the mid-1960s actually it starts with Black Muslims. So Muhammad Ali becoming Muhammad Ali, or Malcolm X renouncing the white slave heritage bit of his name. And then in the late 60s and the 70s, you get these first names, LeBron, and these made up, in inverted commas, names. Okay. Now, in the Caribbean, there was a history of this which kind of predates that. The inhabitants of the Caribbean were less tradition bound by names, though my dad's name is Glenn, but it's Glenn Roy. Okay. I have my uncle's name. I have an Uncle William and whatever. So there's lots of English sounding names. But my father decided before he even met my mother that if he had a son, his son's name was going to be the end of his first two names. So here you go. My father's full name is Glenn Roy is his first name. Garfield is his second name. Glasspole is his third name. Brown is his surname. So Glenn Roy Garfield, the end of his first two names, Roy Field. So he always said, when I have a son, that's what his name is going to be. So my mother had no say in it, but it was thinking about it, it's classically West Indian. So even though it's a made up name and there is only one Roifield, you know, the cognate, you know, version of putting these two, it's LeBron Roifield. Right. It's putting two things together, right. And it's very Black in that regard.
What is your full name?
Sorry?
What is your full name? It's not just where you have middle names.
Okay. Roifield Cleaverton Brown. And that even again, it's so Jamaican. It's so Jamaican because the Cleaverton is made up as well. You know, it's an idea of what sounded sophisticated or clever back in the late 1960s. Right. So that is my name. But it so denotes my parents and where they came from, you know.
Right. Now you're going to have to change your passwords now, right? So no Cleaverton 1, right?
I just want to check. We have a total of 40 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah. So we've got literally 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left.
It's too bad.
So I'm not going to ask the last question, which is a really great question about how was it difficult to become a spokesperson for what we are spokespeople for. That would take us a good 5 minutes to answer, well, more than that. But just a quick point about names. My name is not my name. My experience is pretty typical of Jews who came in through New York. My last name is Marcus. That is not my great-grandfather's name. His name was, I don't know how it was pronounced, but it was something like M-A-C-H-L-E-S or L-I-S. Machlis or Machlis. My first name, Eric, is so, it's like, how does a Jew wind up with a name like Eric? It was because my grandmother objected to my mother naming me Harry, which she thought was too Jewish. My grandmother was a Jewish anti-Semite. So I with the first name of Eric, middle name Brian, which is Irish, and Marcus. And it completely strips me of my heritage, as opposed to you, Roifield, where your parents were determined.
But here's the thing, though. Here's the thing, right? So I've always been a minority in every situation growing up. So it's my norm. Okay. So when you're a kid, who wants a name that sticks out? Right. So when I was a kid, I was Roy to everybody. Hated Roifield. Only my family members would call me Roifield, right? And then I go off to art school as a fancy Dan teenager, 18. I'm like, I've got this unique name. Of
Right.
course, Dev, I'm Roifield all of a sudden. I'm reborn, you know. So.
So we only have 15 seconds left, and I'm going to thank the two of you for this incredible discussion. I wish we had more time, but I'm turning it back over to our trusty moderator.
Oh, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Ray.
I'm sure it was awesome. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you guys for a very inspiring talk. I definitely felt emotional at several points. I'm serious. I'm not just joking here. I got the misty-eyed thing. So anyway, thank you very much, guys. I will see you all at the next talk.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care.
Eric, thank you. Bye, guys.